We are going through the book of 1 Samuel. We've got all the way to the 19th chapter. And we're looking at the life of David. We've seen David as a young boy exhibit incredible faith. You know, I'm just always impressed with David. You know, just a man who was willing to yield himself to God. Now, we're told that before he went up against Goliath that as he was protecting the sheep that God had entrusted, that his father had entrusted to him, that he had fought against lions and bears, and he had defeated them. You know, and you know, it's interesting because you see God come through in other circumstances. You're able to trust him in greater circumstances. And David had seen God protect him against, you know, these vicious animals. And he said, you know what, this Goliath is any different than those vicious animals. God protected me from them. God can protect me from him. And I think really that's how we grow. It's really watching God work through impossible situations and impossible circumstances so that we're beginning to have a greater confidence in God. You start to see God come through situations you thought were impossible. And you go, man, if God can handle that, he can handle this too. And David was learning those lessons. Now he goes up against Goliath. And he's able to remove the head of this 9'6" monster. All of Israel afraid of him, but David not afraid because he had seen God work in the past. And now David is about to go through the most difficult battle of his life. It wasn't going to last a day, it was going to last years. Saul is going to turn on David. He's going to want David killed. He's going to want, you know, him to be eliminated because he was threatened by David's popularity and threatened by God's favor upon David's life. And David's going to be tested like never before. I remember hearing a quote. It said, "Faith that has not been tested is not faith at all." See, God will always test our faith. And in order for your faith to be strengthened, a faith that's not tested can't be strengthened. That's why it's not faith at all. George Mueller, if you ever get a chance to read George Mueller's autobiography, he was a man who started an orphanage. He was a pastor, and there was a lot of kids that had nowhere to go, and George Mueller just believed God was telling him to take in these orphans, and he would take in as many as they would bring them. And oftentimes not even having the food to supply for them, and he would go and he would pray, God, I don't know how you're going to do this, but Lord, we need milk today. And a milk truck would break down right in front of his house and say, you know what, this milk's all going to go to waste. Can you use it? And he would see these kinds of things happen on a regular basis. And George Mueller would always attribute it to, you know, having the confidence to trust God. And if you're willing to trust God, God can do the impossible. In one of the quotes from George Mueller, he says, God delights to increase the faith of his children. We ought, instead of wanting no trials before victory, no exercise for patience, to be willing to take them from God's hand as a means. I say, and I say it deliberately, trials, obstacles, difficulties, and sometimes even defeat are the very food for faith. And David is about to experience that. He's going to experience everything that he had put his life upon get ripped from underneath him. His position, his power, his influence, his wife. He's going to be literally running in the wilderness, hiding in caves in order just to survive as Saul and his armies would pursue him. And then you remember that God had told him that he was going to be the king. I mean, how does that equate? How does that look? I'm supposed to be the king, and I'm living like a dog being chased. And it's through that God was going to make the man that he could use. And I'll tell you guys, if you're going to become an instrument in the hands of God, it doesn't come without trials, without testings, without struggles. Because God can't entrust to you what he wants to entrust to you unless you go through those things. You can't handle them unless you go through those things. And David's going to find that out through his experiences. Now, notice chapter 19. We're going to pick up there. Saul has already attempted to kill David on 2 occasions at this point. He tried to throw a spear at him, and Saul being haunted by evil spirits. Saul in jealousy over what God is doing in David's life. And now here he is, he's before the king again. It's interesting that, if someone threw a spear at me one time, I'd be like, no, I don't think so. And if I'm going to, David's playing the harp for Saul, and he's there playing the harp, and then all of a sudden you see him grab for the spear again. You kind of like, no, I'm out. But David, it didn't faze him. It's interesting because David would continue to put himself in those positions knowing that God was going to be the one who would protect him. Notice chapter 19. Now Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, to all of his servants, and that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, my father Saul seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. And I'll go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe, I'll tell you. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father. And he said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you. Because his work has been very good towards you. For he took his life into his own hands, and he killed the Philistines, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all of Israel. You saw it and you rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without cause? So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Now the thing that Jonathan is interceding for David. He came to David, my dad wants to kill you, man. And David, once again, puts his confidence in a friendship between him and the king's son. As he is now, having all of these incidents happening to him as Saul is just willing to go to any extent to get rid of it. And then he makes he makes this promise to his own boy. I'm not going to kill him, really. And so look at verse 7. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. So Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. And there was a war again, and David went out and he fought with the Philistines, and he struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now the distressing spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing music with his hand, and Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. Now this is the 3rd time that it's interesting that, David would have the confidence to even go back into his presence a 3rd time. But he does. Because David has such confidence in Jonathan. Jonathan and David had this relationship where they were both men of faith, and they both were out there trying to accomplish the things that God had called them to do. And so he comes back in the presence, and then, Saul once again just, furious that David would be put into a position that he was, everyone saw him in, and God's favor and the victories that he would bring about. And so David once again is betrayed by Saul. And guys, and I share this, I think the scripture declares these things, and I think there's something for us to learn here. Is that God is teaching David to trust God, not man. And I'll tell you, in your Christian life, that's a lesson, that's a hard lesson to learn. Remember, Saul was anointed to be king. Remember, Saul prophesied with the prophets. I mean, something obviously had happened in the life of Saul that had put him in the position that God had anointed him to be the king over Israel. And here's the king over Israel, that anointed by God, is wanting to kill you. How do you hold your faith in a situation like that? This is how you hold your faith. My confidence isn't in man, my confidence is in God. And David was going to have to learn the lesson. It was going to go to a greater extent. So look at verse 11. Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and he fled and he escaped. And Michal took an image of, laid it in the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with clothes. And so when Saul sent messengers to take David, he said, he's sick. And Saul sent the messengers back to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed that I might kill him. And when the messengers had come in, there was the image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. Now, I don't know how you get away with showing goat's hair for a head, but it worked. You must say that's some pretty coarse hair. Michal, this is Saul's daughter that David had married. She's also covering for him. Think about it. You got Saul's son Jonathan, you got Saul's daughter Michal, and they're both saying, you know what, God's hand is upon David. We can't, even against our own father's will, we're gonna defend David and warn David and try to help David get out of this situation. And David's able to, at this point, to trust that God is gonna sustain him, protect him, deliver him. In Psalm 59, and let me ask you to turn there. We won't read the whole psalm, but it's the psalm that was written at this particular time when Saul is having his servants surround David's house, and David's let down the window. Watch Psalm 59. I think it gives some insight into what's going on in David's heart at this time. Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Defend me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity, and save me from bloodthirsty men. For look, they lie in wait for my life. The mighty gather against me. Not for my transgressions, nor for my sin, O Lord. They run and prepare themselves through no fault of mine. Awake to help me, and behold, you therefore, O Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Do not be merciful to any wicked transgressors. Selah. At evening they return, they growl like a dog, and they go all around the city. Indeed, they belch with their mouths, swords are in their lips, and they say, who hears? But you, O Lord, shall laugh at them. You shall have all the nation in derision. I will wait for you, O you his strength. Check it out. For God is my defense. I love it. Guys, I understand something. David knew that there was no way for him to win this battle. He knew that unless God defended him, he was going to die. And if you read the rest of that chapter, he just continues on that same thought. But go down to verse 16. We'll just wrap it up at the end there. I will sing to your power. I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning, for you have been my defense and a refuge in the day of my trouble. To you, O my strength, I will sing praises, for God is my defense, my God of mercy. You see, David understood that even though the king and all of his army and all of his men and all of their plotting and all their planning were against him, that they couldn't defeat God. And if God is on my side, then what can man do, right? I mean, that's really, where David's at. He understood that God's the one who was going to, sustain him. God is the one who was going to take care of him. In Psalm 56, another psalm when he was in a different situation, in verse 11, he says, "In God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me?" What can man do? I mean, you just love that you find a man here with great confidence that God was his sustainer and God was protector. You guys, you don't learn that kind of confidence if you never have to use it. If you've never been in the situations where you know you're helpless and if God doesn't come through, you're done. And this is where David is in his life. He's at a place where now he's going to be fleeing. Michal, his wife, letting him down the window. Watch this. Look at verse 16 or 17. Then Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this and set my enemy away so that he has escaped?" And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, "Let me go. Why should I kill you?" I mean, his own kids are lying to him. Because they know what's going on with Saul. Saul's a demented man. He's demonically being influenced, and it's just interesting that he's in this place where his own son Jonathan, his own daughter Michal are saying, "You know what, we don't want to participate in what you're doing." And then notice verse 18. So David fled, and he escaped, and he went to Samuel at Ramah, and he told him all that Saul had done to him, and he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. And it was told Saul, saying, "Take note, David is at Naioth in Ramah." And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the group of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as a leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. Can you imagine? Here comes this big army. They're going to take David away. We come to arrest David. And all of a sudden the Spirit of God comes on them, and they're prophesying. God touched them. Now, it's kind of hard to carry out Saul's commands if the Spirit of God kind of has overwhelmed you. Right? And so, they're there prophesying. They God's Spirit working in them, and they just kind of forego everything that Saul had told them to do because they had an encounter with God. Notice, look at it. It's crazy. Look at the next verse. Verse 21. And when Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. And then Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they prophesied also. I mean, I'm sure Saul's getting pretty frustrated at this point. Everyone I send over there, they start to become spiritual. God's touching everybody that I send. And so Saul decides, you know what, I'll just do it myself. I mean, think about how mad Saul had become. He'd become a madman. Is that if he realizes this first set of messengers are there prophesying, the second set of messengers are prophesying, and the third set of messengers are all prophesying, and none of them are going to follow the commands and the instruction they had given them, you would think, at that point you go like, okay, I really can't do anything. But that wasn't Saul's heart, man. Saul was, I whatever it takes. And if I got to go do it myself, then so be it. And I think there's a sense of rebellion in the heart of Saul. He knew that God had already anointed David to be the king and in his place, and that Saul would get to the point where he says, I don't care what God says, I don't care what God thinks, I don't care that God has already, set this different course. I'm going to hold on to what's mine. And in reality, he was fighting against God. That's a sad place to be in life, when you're fighting against God. You know what truth is. You know what right is. And somehow in your mind, you can excuse all of it. You can dismiss all of it, and you start to look at, well, you know what? I got my own agenda. I got my own will. I don't have to listen to what God says. I don't have to follow what truth says. And Saul's in this place where it's driving him mad. And I'll tell you, when you know truth and you rebel against truth, man, it'll drive you mad. And you can make all the excuses you want. You can blame everybody else around you, man, but you cannot deny truth. And Saul is in this place where it's just building and building and building to the point. Look at verse 22. Then he, Saul, also went to Ramah, and he came to the great well that was in Sheku. So that he asked, and he said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, indeed, they're in Naioth in Ramah. He went there to Naioth and Ramah. Then the Spirit of God was upon him also, and he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. And he also stripped off his clothes, and he prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and he lay down naked all day and all that night. Therefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? I mean, that's weird. Right? I don't know what possessed you to go, you know what, I think I'll just get naked now that I'm prophesying. I mean, something weird's going on in the heart of Saul. But God's Spirit also comes upon him, and he's prophesying. And everyone who's trying to take, how do you fight against God? You can't. You'll lose every time. And somehow in Saul's mind, even after this experience, man, this is what's crazy when you look at the situation. Even after all of this, Saul still doesn't surrender. He still holds on to his rebellion, even though he had seen all of his servants, 3 different, contingencies going, and all of them are prophesying, and then he himself goes and he's prophesying, and even after all of that, Saul still won't relent. That's and I think really what it comes down to, guys, is that this is more than just a physical battle. This is a spiritual battle. This wasn't just Saul being angry. This was Satan stirring. And I think, guys, one of the things you realize, man, is the way that the enemy works. This was a different time. The Spirit of God now comes into a person, and in that time, that the Spirit of God is now dwelling in that person. That time, it wasn't a permanent thing. Now within the New Testament, the Spirit of God dwells in you, and he stays in you when you receive him, right? And there's something different that was happening in the life of Saul. Is that it seems as though it was kind of like a thing that's on and off kind of thing. Now the Spirit, and he's prophesying. He had prophesied earlier, but in between this, before and after all of this, he's now being tormented. And this is what's wild, is that the spiritual battle going on in our culture, in our day, it's just as real as it was there. Except now the battle's for your mind and for your heart. I want to ask you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Check this out. Paul lays it out in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Look at the 3rd verse. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, look at verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare, they're not carnal, but they're mighty in God for pulling down the strongholds. for casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And what Paul declares in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is this is the battle that you and I are facing. It's all in the spiritual battles in the mind. Every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, you're to bring it into captivity. Because the enemy knows how to influence us. He knows that if he can get you thinking things that are contrary to truth, contrary to God, then he can defeat you. If he can spin you out and put some offense in your heart against somebody or something or some situation, and then he can allow that just to fester and grow. And if you don't battle it with God's word and God's truth, then he begins to take, the influence in your life. And you and I have to understand that it's a spiritual battle going on. And the battle's for your soul. And you have to bring the thoughts into captivity. You have to say, you know what? That thought doesn't line up with truth. That doesn't line up with what God says. So that's a lie. And if you don't fight that spiritual battle, man, you will get spun out and you'll be deceived. And Saul finds himself in that very same position, man. He's spun out and he's deceived because he even though he knows the truth in his own life, even though he knows that Samuel told him, you know what, God's going to take his hand off of you and he's going to place it on another man who has a heart after God's own heart. And even though Saul knew these things, man, he was going to hold on to it and fight against it with everything he has to the very bitter end. Truth will prevail. And God's word will win. And if you go against it, man, you're the one who will lose. Guaranteed. And what's interesting is as we come to chapter 20, man, we have a whole nother situation taking place because Saul's put his confidence in who? He's put his confidence in Jonathan. He's put his confidence in Michael. He's put his confidence in Samuel. But in all of that, he was putting his confidence in the Lord. And as we come to chapter 20, he makes another journey back to Jonathan again. Because Jonathan and him, had this bond as men. They were warriors together. They had fought battles together. They trusted each other with their own lives. And so he comes back to chapter 20, watch. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah, and he went and he said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? And Jonathan said to him, by no means, you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. Now, Jonathan hadn't heard at this point that Saul is still out to kill him. And it was true. He was hiding it from Jonathan because he knew Jonathan had David's back. And it's interesting that Jonathan had took his dad's word back in chapter 19, verse 6. Remember, he said, look, I give you my word. He was not going to die. And Jonathan believed his dad that he wasn't going to do it. And so Jonathan's going, no, you're crazy, David. My dad doesn't want to kill you. And David took an oath again, verse 3. And he said, your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes. And he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. And I think for the first time we see in the life of David this a little bit of wavering in his faith. For the first time, he's going, look, I'm just right here, man. I could die at any moment now. When we get to chapter 21 next week, and one of the things that, David is going to act like a madman as he goes before the Philistines. And, there's a couple of times where David's just thinking, man, I got to do whatever I got to do in order to survive. He had somehow lost his confidence in God. And I think for all of us, man, there are those moments in our walk where we go through the valleys and we go to the mountaintops, and where we question things, and we have to wrestle with those things, and we got to come back and say, God, I need to hear from you, and I need wisdom from you. I got to get in your word. I need to seek your counsel. Because all of us, we're all frail. We have our moments where you're just like, man, I'm ready to take on the world, and then the next day you're in the dumps. It's spiritual. And it's where God forges us. It's where he makes us the men and women he desires us to be. We got to wrestle with those things. And David is wrestling with these things. Look, I can die. He's telling Jonathan, I'm one step away from death. I mean, don't you get it, Jonathan? He's at the point where he's wavering. And it seems as though Jonathan had more faith than even David did at this point. Because you're not going to die. No, look at verse 4. And Jonathan said to David, whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you. And David said to Jonathan, indeed, tomorrow is the new moon. I should not fail to sit with the king to eat, but let me go, that I may hide in the field until the third day at evening. And if your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city, and there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. And if he says thus, it is well, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, be sure that evil is determined by him. And therefore you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Nevertheless, if there is iniquity in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? Man, think that, or David, if I've done something wrong, just hack me up right here. Just get it over with. You kill me. I'd rather you kill me because I'm guilty than to bring me for your father who hates me and he's going to kill. If I've offended you, if I've wronged you, if I've done something against the king, just do it now. And notice Jonathan's response. Jonathan said, far be it from you. For if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you? And David said to Jonathan, who will tell me? Or what if your father answers you roughly? And Jonathan said to David, come and let us go up into the field. So both of them went up into the field, and Jonathan said to David, the Lord God of Israel is witness. When I have sounded out my fathers sometime tomorrow or the third day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I'll report to you, and I'll send you away that you may go in safety, and the Lord will be with you as he has been with my father. And notice Jonathan acknowledging, you know what? God's hand's upon you, David, as it was upon my father at one point. It's interesting, Jonathan, being a man of faith, is able to identify the heart of God and the will of God and the plans of God and, the evidence that God was doing in David's life, even though the loyalty to his own father, is still there. And his loyalty to God superseded even the loyalty to his own dad, who was the king. And it's interesting as you look at this whole picture, you get to see, how a man of faith is responding in a very difficult situation. He's learning to trust God. He's learning to navigate through difficulties and trials and tribulations. Look, verse 14. He says, and you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I'm still alive, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of your enemies of David from the face of the earth. And I love what Jonathan says. He said, look, David, you're going to make, our covenant is that you'll take care of me and you'll take care of my descendants after me. That'll come into play later. We'll see that after Jonathan dies and Saul dies. David keeps his promise to the descendants of Jonathan. And what's interesting in this whole picture is that Jonathan knew that no matter what happened, David was going to be the king. And he's looking for favor from David because he knew that God's hand was upon him. And then verse 16, so Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan again caused David to vow because he loved him, and for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new moon, and you'll be missed because your seat will be empty. And when you have stayed 3 days, go down quickly and come to the place where you did on the day of the deed, and remain by the stone Izel. And I will shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at a target. And there I'll send a lad, saying, go find the arrows. If I expressly say to the lad, look, the arrows are on this side of you, get them and come. Then as the Lord lives, there is safety for you and no harm. But if I say thus to the young man, look, the arrows are beyond you, go your way, for the Lord has sent you away. And I you know what, guys, I think there's something in the heart of Jonathan. Look, this is in the hands of God now. This isn't God's will for your life is going to be identified, and it's going to be identified by whether you come back into the kingdom or you have to flee the kingdom. But either way, it's going to be the Lord. And I think there's something for that for all of us, guys. You understand something. God's the one who's in control. He knows what your next step is. He knows what your life is. And it's not always what we want it to be or what we think it to be. But you and I need to have this understanding that we serve a sovereign God who's in control of everything. And I can trust him even when I'm going through the trials or I'm fleeing for my life. That God in that has a purpose and he's got a plan. And I love that Saul, Jonathan in this, instance is saying, look, we're going to find out God's will one way or the other. We're going to find out whether God's will is for you to come back into the kingdom or God's will is for you to flee at this point. Notice this. Verse 19, when you have stayed 3 days, go down quickly, come into the place where you hid on that day of the deed, and remain by the stone Izel, and I'll shoot the arrow to the side as though I shot at the target, and there I'll send a lad. Verse 22, I backed up too far. And I say thus to the young man, look, the arrows are beyond you, go your way, and the Lord has sent you away. For the Lord has sent you away. Verse 23, and as for the matter which you and I have spoken, indeed, the Lord be between you and me forever. And David hid in the field. The new moon come, king sat down to eat the feast. The king sat at his seat as at other times, on a seat by the wall, and Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, and David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought something had happened to him. He's unclean, surely he's unclean. It happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty, and Saul said to Jonathan, his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to eat, either yesterday or today? And Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brothers have commanded me to be there. Now if I found favor in your eyes, please let me go away and see my brothers. Therefore he has not come to the king's table. And Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? Wow. That had to be a cuss word. I mean, Saul is beside himself. You son of a mother. You're like, whoa. That's in the Bible, right? And it's crazy because you realize that what's happening is that Saul is trying to hold on to something that's no longer his. He thinks that he can somehow win this battle against God's will and against God's plan. And it's driving him mad. It's driving him crazy. Because he's fighting against God, and you will never win that battle. And Saul thinks that somehow he can. Your mom's a rebellious woman, you're a perverse, and he's, wow. But Saul says something else here, and it's interesting. He says, you've chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness. And what's interesting in that passage and what we find out what's in Saul's heart is that he had put himself in opposition to God to such a degree that what should have been his elevation, his acknowledgement, his blessing upon this young boy David, now it's his curse. And guys, when we start to disagree with God and what he says and what he declares and what his will is, man, you are left with nothing but misery. And to think that this man would become that irate against truth, against God's declaration, against God's prophecy, against God's plan, man, it's scary. It's scary because I see it. I see it in so many lives today, where they just rebel against truth, mock God, mock his word, mock his truth. And all it does is make you more angry and bitter, and you just begin down this spiral of destruction. And it's just a sad state to think that somehow life is going to be better outside of the will of God than to be, life inside of the will of God. And that's how the enemy works. He wants you to think that there's something better than God's will for your life. There's something better out there that'll make me happier, that'll make me, freer, and the enemy just knows how to mess with you to get you to that place where you actually believe it. And I think it's exactly what, look what he says in verse 31. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Wow. As long as David's alive, you will never fulfill your destiny, Jonathan. So we need to kill him. And I'll tell you, man, that is the lie that the enemy tells over and over and over again. That if I just do my will, I'll fulfill my destiny, even if it's against God's will. And it will never happen. It's a lie from the pit of hell. And Jonathan's going to find out, and Saul's going to find out the hard way. Look at verse 32. And Jonathan answered Saul his father, and he said, why should he be killed? What has he done? And Saul cast a spear at Jonathan to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. I mean, think about how he's worried about Jonathan not becoming the king. Now he's throwing a spear and he's trying to kill his own son. How demented can you get? The very thing that you're claiming to want to protect, you're willing to kill. Sad. And you realize, man, that once you get to this place, you lose all sense of truth and reason and logic. That now you're just at this point where it doesn't even matter anymore. I don't care what it costs me. I'm going to win my battle. And that's exactly where he's at. Look at verse 34. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger. He ate no food the second day of the month, and he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. And so it was in the morning that Jonathan went out in the field. At that time appointed with David, and a little lad was with him. And he said to the lad, now run, find the arrows which I shoot. And as the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the lad had come to the place where the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried out after the lad, and he said, is not the arrow beyond you? And Jonathan cried out after the lad, make haste, hurry, do not delay. So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master. But the lad did not know anything. Only Jonathan, David, knew of the matter. Here's this innocent kid, just there thinking, I'm just doing what Jonathan's asking me to do. His arm bearer, they're helping Jonathan. He shoots the arrows, and he's in there, and he didn't even know that he's the messenger that Jonathan was using to convey to David what was happening. And how many times in our own lives, man, that we're clueless to what God's doing. We're clueless to what's going on around us, but God still is moving it. His message and his plan and his purposes all taking place. And this little lad gets sent away. It says that he said, go carry the weapons back to the city. And then verse 41, and we'll wrap it up here. Watch this. As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from the place toward the south. And he fell. And he fell on his face to the ground. And he bowed down 3 times, and they kissed one another, and they wept together, and David more so. And Jonathan said to David, go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants. So he arose, and he departed, and Jonathan went into the city. And Jonathan still is loyally to his father. All of the things that are transpiring here. David now fleeing. And when we get into chapter 21, and we're gonna get David running away and from Saul, and he begins his now wilderness time where he was going to have to learn how to depend on God on a greater level. But it's just interesting, and all of this, you look at that, all of it upon the will of God. All of it. I think sometimes we kind of stand back and we go, well, all the good things, that's the will of God, and the bad things, that's not the will of God. No, you know what? All of it was God preparing the man. God taking him through the things of life so that he would learn the lessons as he was going to become the king of Israel. And not only the king of Israel, he was going to be one of the great kings of Israel, the great king of Israel. David's mentioned in the Bible more than anyone else except Jesus. He's one of the main characters. It's the descendant of David that takes the kingship, and he's speaking of the Messiah. Little did David know through all of this that God had a plan for his life, that God was going to establish David, that God was going to elevate David, that he was going to give him victory over all the Philistines. He was going to gather all the gold and the silver to build God's house. He was going to be the guy that had the plans given to him by God in order for the tabernacle to be built, the temple to be built. Solomon, his son, gets the privilege of building it. It was David who would receive the instructions on how to build it. David who had gathered up the gold. David becomes an instrument that God is going to use tremendously. I'll guarantee you he wasn't feeling it that day. He had no idea, in the middle of all of this, that this was God's way of preparing him for what he had for him. And I'll tell you, Christian, man, that is the school that God will take you through before he can use you. You got to go through the school of faith. And faith only comes by testing. Faith only comes through wrestling through the things that don't make sense, the things that we don't understand. Where we got to come to that place where you say, okay, God, I don't get it, but I know you do. I'm going to trust you anyway. I'm going to trust you in spite of. And I know, over the last 30 years walking with the Lord, man, I've been on the highs and I've been on the lows. I've been in times where I go, God, I don't even know if you hear me. I don't even know if you listen to me. I don't know if you care. I don't know if you're real. And then I got to come back and get into the Word and then come back and say, God, help me through this. I can't do it unless you do it. And you pull out of that and you see God answer prayer, and you see God, pull you through that trial and that tribulation. And then you realize, you know what? God's faithful. God's able. And then he gets you a little bit stronger, and then he puts you through another trial that becomes a little more difficult. And this time you got a little more metal to you. You got a little more ability to wither the storm. But it doesn't make it any easier. You still buckle at the knees, and then you get through that trial. And it's just God maturing you and growing you and teaching you to trust him, to seek him, to not put your confidence in your emotions or your feelings or in men or in anything else, but your confidence has to be in him. And sometimes God will have to take away your counselors. He'll have to take your friends. He'll have to take away relationships. Sometimes he's got to strip you of everything in order for you to be at the place where you're going, okay, God, I have nowhere else to turn but to you. And God will do it. Because he's in the business of making warriors for his kingdom, for his glory. And David's going to be one of those warriors. Oh, not just, David's already a warrior. Think about it. David would wipe out the Philistines, and God had given him great skill in doing the physical battle, but now he's learning how to fight the spiritual battle. This is the guy they said, Saul slayed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Saul said, you go give me 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and I'll give you my daughter to be a wife. David comes back with 200. This guy was a warrior. But he only knew how to fight in the physical. He had to learn how to fight in the spiritual. And the only way you fight in the spiritual is through those crises, it's through those trials, it's through those tribulations, it's through those wrestlings. And then you come out of it and you realize, you know what? Man, I serve a God that's bigger than anything that I'll face. And I serve a God that can handle every situation I'll encounter. And it's through those lessons that you're tested, so that you can be what God intended you to be.